Texas is a big state, but you're never alone.
The Alzheimer's Association is here to help.
We're all in this together.
From El Paso to Houston.
From Dallas to San Antonio.
From Austin to Fort Worth.
Check out the online offerings from your chapter. Stay home, stay safe.
We're here for you, Texas.
Day or night.
Go to www.alz.org.
Or call us at 1-800-272-3900.
Your caring never stops, and neither do we.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Delia Gervier, and I'm the Executive Director for the Alzheimer's Association Capital of Texas chapter. I want to welcome you on this lovely Saturday morning to our 4th annual Caregiver Conference, for the first time virtual. Thank you for taking time out of your busy Saturday morning, and I'm sure, to come and be a part of this learning experience. We have quite the lineup for you. We have some exciting experts in the field ready to speak to you about the things that are important to caregivers of people with Alzheimer's disease. We appreciate you being here, and we hope that you have a great day of learning, and we hope that you get lots of great information. So again, thank you for being here this morning, and we really appreciate your time.
Good morning. My name is Maxine P. I'm the Program Director for the Alzheimer's Association Capital of Texas chapter. Welcome again to our program this morning. We look forward to this day. This is our first time running a virtual conference, so bear with us with some of the glitches. We appreciate your patience. This morning we have Dr. Lozano, but prior to her speaking, we have a commercial from Belmont Village for you to join. Just a second, please. Belmont Village happens to be one of our top sponsors, not only for educational programs, but also for our walk teams. So we're very appreciative of their support throughout the year. And so although they couldn't be here this morning, we very much appreciate their support and wanted to showcase what they do already in the community. So this morning we have Dr. Yvonne Lozano. She has been a supporter of the Alzheimer's Association for many years, for I would want to say over 20 years. I'm hoping I'm not dating Yvonne. But this morning she's going to join us. And just to give you a little brief history of who Dr. Lozano is and what she's done, she is currently a professor of gerontology at the University of the Incarnate Word. In addition, she is a member of the Gerontology Society of America, American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, National Association of Social Workers, and Sigma Pi Omega. Dr. Lozano has served on the board of directors for the Alzheimer's Association, Bear Area Agency on Aging in San Antonio, Christian Senior Services, the Long-Term Care Coalition, and so on, many other things. So we're trying to get her video queued up this morning, and hopefully just run with it. Okay, Yvonne, can you unmute yourself, Yvonne?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Okay, thanks for joining us this morning. Thank you for joining us this morning, Dr. Lozano. We are very appreciative of you taking the time to be part of this great event that we're having. And you want to say a few words before we queue up your presentation?
Sure. Well, just to make sure, I think if someone releases the shared screen, it's locked, I can share my screen real quickly. And also, I'm always very excited to be a part of any work that I can do to support the Alzheimer's Association and support caregivers. Maxine is right. I've been doing this for many years, in addition to into my own personal experiences with my mother who had dementia, and also my professional experience prior to teaching. In academia, I worked in a geriatric mental health facility where we treated a lot of patients with dementia and some of the behavioral issues that came along with that. And so I am excited to be here. I've devoted my life to working in this field, and now I work with students and to help train them to be able to work with individuals with these disorders. So I appreciate being able to be here and being a part of this group. And it's exciting to see all that we can do virtually. I know there's a lot of things to get used to, but there's a lot of great things that can continue to happen. And thank you for having me be here. I much appreciate it. There we go. I think we're on now. Can everyone see that, Maxine?
Yes, I can see your screen. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me get it into slideshow mode. Can you just see one slide right now?
Yes.
Okay, we're good to go. All right, Maxine, if you're ready, I'm ready.
You're ready to start.
I want to make a note here. Maxine and I had discussed before the presentation that I want to leave this open for questions. So Maxine, I'll take your directive.
Okay.
When it's a good time to stop, just say before I move to the next slide, just let me know, and I'm happy to pause and answer questions or hear comments.
Very well.
Okay, as all of you know, today's topic is where did you go? It's living with ambiguous loss. This is not a new topic in this field, particularly looking at the area of dementia and ambiguous loss, because ambiguous loss plays a role and fits into many different forms of issues and medical issues that individuals might have. But I hope that you learned something new today, and I'm looking forward to sharing this. So what is ambiguous loss? This term, this theory, if you will, was developed by Dr. Pauline Boss. She originated the term ambiguous loss, and she was the principal theorist. And so much of what you see here today regarding what it is directly came from her, and I'm sharing that with you. It's a type of loss that happens when a person with dementia is physically present, but at times psychologically absent. So that in itself should already begin to kind of speak to you as exactly what we're referring to here, and being able to look at someone who you see the person that has dementia, they're physically there, for the most part may even be physically well, but obviously psychologically, mentally, and emotionally are not there. So the ambiguity in being able to beginning to experience the loss, being able to start to grieve that loss, being able to trying to determine how that you're going to manage is what we're going to start talking about today. Let's see if I went too far. In the words of a caregiver who spoke about ambiguous, he said, "The word ambiguous helped me understand what was going on. I'm still married to my wife. I love her, but I don't live with her. I've always been crazy about her, and still am. She's looked after, but it is a huge loss for me. The ambiguity is exactly how I feel." Not being present. A family caring for a person with dementia may experience ongoing stress and grief due to the ambiguous loss of having a spouse or parent still there, but not present in the same way as before. So you begin to have this sense, obviously the person hasn't passed on, obviously the person is still there, both physically and even remnants of their personality, remnants of who they used to be, even moments in which it doesn't even seem as if they have dementia, they have Alzheimer's any longer. So this is why it's important to recognize that how one might feel and begin to feel a sense of strong grief when these thoughts and these experiences begin to happen. When looking at kind of a comparison, you look at sudden death versus ambiguous grief. This is something that's very different from loss and grief of sudden death, someone dying in a car accident or from a heart attack. For example, where the person who is experiencing the loss knows clearly that the person is gone. They're no longer there, they're no longer with you. It's often likely to receive, maybe they'll have support from family and from friends after the loss to kind of support them through their grief and through their most recent experience. And eventually they'll find closure through natural grieving process. So you can already start to see how different this may be, how different there may be for someone who's experiencing the loss of someone who is still there. They haven't passed on. So because they're experiencing grief, no one is really talking to them about grief and experiencing the loss that they may have. And if someone is doing that, sometimes they don't recognize some of the symptoms that they're experiencing from that. And they're actually in those initial stages of the grief and as they become the bereaved. Something that's important to keep in mind is that there's something called complicated grief. And the years that I've been teaching, I've taught a death in 9 class for almost 15 years now. One of the most common discussions, or most often the discussions that are usually very strong in the classroom, is when we talk about the complicated grief. Ambiguous loss does complicate grief and can become complicated grief because it's hard for someone to know what to start grieving, especially for the caregiver, to know whether or not how to grieve when aspects of the person with dementia are lost. When there's still some aspects of that person that are still there, as I mentioned earlier, and then there's aspects of the person that are lost. So you can see why someone could easily go back and forth as they begin to experience this. When we start to talk about complicated grief and what that means, is that part of it is that you're experiencing it and you're not. You experience it and you don't. So this is where it becomes complicated and difficult for someone to be able to look at it in front of them, be able to decide and determine how they can manage this. So a lot of times family and friends are not going to recognize the caregiver even has a need to grieve at that particular time, and that the many losses of the different stages, as someone with Alzheimer's disease begins to progress and begins to lose more and more, this grief becomes even more apparent, and it becomes the senses and the feelings and the thoughts and the emotions from that grief even become more apparent. So, yes.
I was just going to say, I think when people have, when they find themselves in this stage, is that much more difficult, because we often take for granted that even though caregivers do not share their losses and their little steps that they take every day, we often overlook that they their own special needs, their own health and mental status of where they find themselves in that moment. I know that with my mother, I don't think I fully felt the impact of her loss until she passed away. But that was almost every day you started to see the different stages that she was taking, where she was no longer independent and very much, dependent on both my sister and myself to do her everyday things. So I can just imagine what caregivers are feeling when they get a diagnosis and then they're forward in their lives.
Yeah, and Maxine, you make some important points. One of them also is that the caregiver kind of losing sight of their own needs. And that's because there's so much to consider, so much to take care of around them as they become that immediate caregiver. And of course, in all the years that I've worked with caregivers and all the research that's out there regarding caregivers, we all know that this is one of the most important components of being able to make it through these days and just to keep yourself as healthy as you possibly can, and to be able to seek support to be able to do so. Because in the midst of all that, in the midst of not taking care of yourself, you're also having issues, particular issues with grief, and which includes things like sadness and depression. And some people don't even recognize that's what they're experiencing until so much of those symptoms begin to impact their physical being. So it's critical that it's something that's recognized. Thank you for that, Maxine. It also impacts relationships. And when you think of ambiguous loss, it confuses relationships and sometimes prevents people from being able to move on. And this could be particularly true. For example, a spouse may feel as if they're no longer in a marital relationship, especially starts to experience it when their partner doesn't even know who they are, or doesn't even recognize that they were married, or they were together, or they were partners. So in that particular case, that's another loss. Not only losing the loss of who that person used to be, now having lost the relationship, the intimacy of that relationship, the plans that were made. That's a loss too. People have plans. I mean, we all have plans. And of course, part of that reality is what we're experiencing now with COVID. People have plans, and that there's a loss with that. There's a loss to not being able to be and live your life in the way that you always thought you could live it. And that's part of taking things for granted, but it's also part of being able to adapt to it, to be able to have the resilience to be able to move forward with it and do things differently. In some cases, you don't know what's going to happen, how long Alzheimer's is going to be, and that, how long that disease is going to carry on, how long that person will live with it. And there's also uncertainty of behavior changes, physical problems for the caregivers, emotional problems for the caregivers, someone who's just unable to grieve. So you can only imagine if you're not with someone, what that must feel like. And that's often I think about that in regards to COVID, where a lot of these individuals are not able to be with their families at when they take their last breath, and not being able to be able to say goodbye or to feel like they have that closure. And so unable to grieve and unable to fully grieve because your emotions and your mental world and your physical world are needing those things to occur. So anticipating losses too, what else is going to happen? That anticipation of losses also creates some level of grief because you know that it's not over. What you're experiencing now is only a part. What's going to come in a week or 2 weeks or 2 years is unknown. And because you know that person is just a little bit at a time is going to continue to lose more and more of him or her. So, this is what I think it's important to be creative. Individuals and families recognize that ambiguous loss exists and that there are feelings that come from that ambiguous loss. Work through these feelings, find creative, work through them by finding support at the Alzheimer's Association, talking with friends, talking with families, talk with a grief counselor, begin to work particularly on that loss. as if you would, as if that person had passed. Find creative ways, because let me just say this before I go on, because the caregiver feels a sense of loss for that person, obviously, and the anticipation of further loss. It's important to keep in mind to find creative ways to engage with the person with dementia. And what do I mean by that? This is probably, in all the years that I worked in the geriatric psych unit, where we had a lot of patients with dementia. This is something that we worked really hard to learn how to do, is to be creative. And it doesn't mean that you have to be creative in the sense of, of painting or photography, where you use your creative side. But you have to think outside of the box. So many caregivers get themselves stuck in a way of thinking and doing that is not really beneficial to themselves and to the person that they're caring for, because it's difficult to move outside of that box. Because we all know that a day with someone with Alzheimer's, every day is not the same day. Now, it may feel that way to you, and sometimes because of what you're doing and the amount of work that it takes to be able to care for someone, but it isn't the same day. So that level of creativity is also very important and critical for your emotional well-being and the well-being of the person that you're caring for. I want to go back to this for a second. I just remembered something. There's a lot of work and studies being done now, and I know this sounds kind of silly maybe to some of you, on the issue of robots in caregiving. And they're very expensive, I heard. But one of the things that I thought was interesting as they develop these robots and begin to evolve in kind of in what they want them to do with someone who is at home, who needs caregiving. And I thought, this is exactly what we talk about with caregivers. And that is that they try to find that connection with them. It can be anything, a way to connect. And they try to do that with the robot. They ask family members and friends, like, how can I connect with this person? So in some cases, this is just an example. The robot, the person who is the caregiver, the person who is being cared for, may have been someone who loved baseball. I mean, adored it. I watched every game on TV, even if it wasn't his or her team. And so now the robot is going to say, remember that game in 1968 when you took the kids to go see the Houston Astros play? You remember that game? And so they have the memories of that person. And what they're finding is that connection is what's helping that person sometimes with Alzheimer's disease being able to have those discussions. So it's a way to not lose that part of that person. And as a caregiver, I'm not saying to get a robot, but I'm just saying that the important part of that story is the connection, that they're even working with robots. And so as a human being, you're going to know more about that person probably than anyone else, or you're going to find out as much as you can about that person, and maybe keep trying to find ways to connect that are familiar to him or her, and that create some sense of connection between the two of you that will help kind of be able to manage some of these feelings of the loss. Maxine, does anyone, let me know if you want to ask any questions, because
I was just going to allude, having the robots or utilizing robots in caregiving, like you were, mentioning, it's also similar to having that connection through music. I know that there's studies around music and memory where even individuals that otherwise do not speak or engage, if they listen to the music from their time, they almost become alive, and they start either humming away or singing the lyrics, and amazingly enough, they know the lyrics. They still remember those lyrics. So these are good things for our families to always remember, and we'll learn more of that in other presentations later this morning.
Yes.
Is how to still be connecting with individuals, how to still utilize what we know of them. And this is where knowing the people we care for is very important. The better we know them, the better we can interact with them, even when they can't verbalize or speak to us in the manner that they used to speak.
And also, regards to ambiguous grief, Maxine, what this does is, if you can somehow connect the two of the lives that you used to live together, or experience together, whether it's a parent or a sibling or a spouse or a significant other, if you can still connect in some way, it somehow helps to manage some of the loss that someone might be experiencing, some of the grief.
Right.
Always keep those things in mind. I'm glad you're going to hear more about the music later. These are unique losses and grief that are experienced by family members caring for a person with dementia, and a lot of times they're not recognized. When the grief is not acknowledged or validated by anyone, by the person who's experiencing, by people around them, it is known as disenfranchised grief, and its effects on the caregiver can become very debilitating. The lack of acknowledgement compounds the grief because the person is in danger of feeling more alone. And this is often sometimes seen with someone who actually someone passes and there's closure and they have a funeral and they have friends and family that come around and surround that person at their time of their loss, at their time of their grief. And then, you know, after that, let's say a week later, everybody's gone, you know, everyone stopped coming by or bringing by food or caring for them. And there's that disenfranchised grief that can occur because the expectation and the anticipation is that that person now move on. It's time to move on now. You've done all the steps that you needed to take. And yes, it's going to take a while and you're going to have some bad moments. But this can even make it more debilitating for some people. And there is, you know, I talked about the complicated grief. There are some times in which there has to be some formal intervention for that person to be able to manage this, but not acknowledging it, not addressing it, not talking with someone, not seeking that support, not trying to determine what it is you're feeling and how it's impacting you and the person you're caring for. This is very significant because a lot of what the stress that someone might be feeling in caring for someone's Alzheimer's, the stress on their bodies, the physical and the emotional pain that's going on, could all be directly related to this disenfranchised grief. Because it doesn't seem, if you think about it, it doesn't seem that you should start feeling this grief yet to this extent, because you're like, well, they haven't died yet. When they die, I'll feel more of that. But that's not really what your mind and your body is trying to tell you. It's like any other grief process. So the grief process is exactly that. There has to be a grief process. So when the ambiguous loss is present, this is what we want to see occurring. But it's because it's not common for family members caring for persons with dementia, it's not something that they're going to understand. Understanding the concept is a vital first step that can be helped to ease its effects.
Yvonne, we do have a couple questions.
Yes, please.
One is, what's the best way to help a caregiver who's going through this if you're another family member?
If you're another family member who's actively involved what I mean by that, or at least involved with communicating or being a part of that caregiver's life, I think it's a time to sit down and talk with them about what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. Maybe teaching them about could it be grief? Could it be grief that you're experiencing now? If you see that person is not getting any better, meaning that they're getting to a point where they're sick, or they're not sleeping, and all those symptoms that we sometimes see as stress, which we now recognize can be grief, to maybe refer them to the Alzheimer's Association or professional counseling to be able to seek that support. The Alzheimer's Association and their support groups are a big help because you can talk to other people who are having the very same, maybe not the same stories, but the exact experiences so far as what they're feeling and their emotions. I think this is often a mistake that caregivers make, quite frankly. In the years that I've worked with caregivers, in the years that I've really helped work with the Alzheimer's Association and volunteered, I've often found that caregivers that will be the last thing they do in seeking out that assistance. And for some, it's not necessarily due to them just, I'm too busy, I don't have anything to do. It's just that they don't have the energy to seek that out. So someone else coming along, like a family member or a friend or a colleague, and nudging them into into that healing is important. Because remember, when you start grieving, it's a process of healing too. That's kind of the what we're hoping for the end result here. I hope that answered the question.
It does. Thank you. And then we have another question. It says, as either a professional or a family member, how do we help the caregiver recognize that they're going through this or they're not managing the grief accordingly?
Well, that's probably two questions there. One is, how do you help them recognize, and that is to be familiar with some of the symptoms and that I've just mentioned, and I'm going to talk about some more too. And some of that is sadness and depression, this whole feeling of being alone, this overwhelming sense of doom for some people. All of those symptoms where they're not maybe, and even that can start to interact or start to impact their daily living, which is, really not taking care of themselves, whether through hygiene and maybe sometimes just crying all the time, this overwhelming sense of dread and depression. Anxiety also plays a role in this as well. And then physical symptoms too, gastrointestinal symptoms, not feeling like you want to eat, not feeling like you want to do anything, and all the energy you have is just to be able to care for that person. So it's important to have a talk with them and make them aware of what these symptoms are and how important it is to seek help.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
We're good to go. Thanks.
Okay. So here's some of the effects of ambiguous loss. It immobilizes individual and thus their relationships. So it's, when we think about immobile, what does that mean? And not being able to move, or you don't really have this whole sense of being able to do anything outside of what you do every single day at that moment. So it freezes you. It freezes you in your steps. It freezes you in everything that you do, and the reasons that you do those things. Also, this is when I was putting this presentation together, this next one on confuses decision-making process really struck me a little bit differently than anything I had thought about before. When people are under a significant amount of stress, we know that decision-making is difficult. And you know how they always hear, in the middle of your crisis, in the middle of a divorce or grief or a loss, changing jobs, it's not the good time to make a decision, big decisions, if you will. But even for the caregiver, in this particular sense, even small decision makings become difficult. It becomes very draining. Do I call the doctor? Should I make an appointment? Should I bring them to the physician? Should I talk to them about changing the medications? All of it becomes confusing for them. This is kind of this vortex of sadness and disorientation that someone can start to feel because they're experiencing so many symptoms from the ambiguous loss and the grief. So it freezes the grief process too, because the grief process needs to be just that. It needs to be a process that this person can go through to be able to start to move forward, to be able to take the steps necessary to heal. But if that freezes and it stays there, you can imagine all the symptoms that comes along with that also freezes as well. And then it blocks coping process. This is so important. To me, it's the most important of all these 6 that are mentioned, because if you cannot cope with this whole process of grief, then nothing else will matter. It will be very difficult to be able to not have things happen like physical illnesses, stress-related disorders, even just kind of this inability to be able to cope with even small things that occur. It can set you off like the faucet won't quit dripping. You can't even figure out how to get that fixed. It just becomes overwhelming for everyone. And then it prevents closure. As we all know, that this whole sense of closure is important. And I have some ideas for this too, and we'll talk about them later. as long as I've been teaching death and dying, and my experience, I want to mention when I'm done with this slide, my own experiences, but it leads to feeling helpless and exhausted and hopeless. And if anybody has ever gone through any form of grief, it is very, very tiring. And I think you just feel exhausted. And if you're not able to process it because the process is frozen or because it's blocked, then these feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and exhaustion are not going to go away. I want to mention a short story about myself, just kind of break this up. I realize that this is not the topic you want to hear on a Saturday morning. However, it is very important information that can help change your life for people that are having these experiences. But I grew up in San Antonio, and anyone who knows me knows that I was very close to my grandmother. I lived next door to her. It was my parents and myself, and then later 2 siblings that came along. I spent a significant amount of time. She was the oldest of 21 children, and she was definitely the matriarch in this family. And since I lived next door to her, and we became very close, and she was the person who kind of organized the funerals, if you will, or the wakes. Back then they had wakes. And as a 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7-year-old girl, until we moved from where she was, she would take me with her to these wakes. I would help her prepare the bodies. I would help her kind of clean the rooms up. I never really had a fear of someone who had passed or who was dying, because sometimes she took me in there to be with her, to help the family members when that person was in their last few minutes of their life. Hence, probably why I spent my time now teaching in this field. And what I also recognized was that one of the things that she did is that she would check in on these individuals. Some of them were families and some were just friends. And she would take me with her to do this too. And even long after that person had passed, because she taught me later as I got older that it was important for them to know that there were still people there for them, that there were people there who cared about them, and that they could get through this. And that was back in the day, to date me again, like Maxine did this morning. That was back in the day when, and at least with our culture, the Mexican American culture, my grandmother said, when someone died, we couldn't have the TV or the radio on for 7 days. I don't know where she got the 7 days, but we did the 7-day thing. And they would sometimes, in some cases, they would black out the house. And what that meant is that you couldn't have the windows open. And so it was in respect for the person who was bereaved, to be able to surround yourself around them and give them all that they needed to get through this so that they would eventually be able to go on with their life. And that reminds me of this, of the importance of being able to address this now. And because the person hasn't passed on, there's just that tendency to feel like, why should I start grieving when they're still here? Well, you're grieving a lot more than the actual death. It's the loss and the death of the personality or who the person was. So what we know is there's many faces of grief. It's natural. It's a complex response to a person's perceived loss. There are many different ways in which people experience grief, but there are also commonalities in how they experience grief. Every individual's experience of grief is unique. So how I experience grief in my life is not going to be the same way that you experience. And what I used to be able to get through those things is not going to be something that you may be able to use either. But you can talk to people and you can find out, how can I manage this and how can I work through it? Sadness is often considered to be the most normal and appropriate expression of grief. Excuse me. But anger and situational depression, irritability, annoyance, intolerance, and frustration, I want you to hear all those symptoms and tell me if they're not common of people who work with caregivers or who are caregivers, someone taking care of someone with Alzheimer's who's not had this experience. Situational depression, which means that this is depression that's specific to the situation, the event, the circumstances occurring now. Irritability, annoyance, intolerance, and all those things are also very common for someone who's in the throes of caregiving and experiencing many difficulties. Frustration also, not being able to handle very small things that were never a problem before, and this can be exacerbated by not sleeping. Ongoing changes in lifestyle and roles, and the other challenges that go along with caregiving. And then also that anxiety of that fear of separation and the unknown that comes along. It's that fear of separation, that disconnect, that even begins to make this grief even more complicated.
Yvonne,
Yes.
we have a question from our Facebook Live page, and it says, right now in COVID situation, do you find that the grieving process is accelerated due to the fact that many caregivers cannot visit their loved ones?
Oh gosh, yes. I worry about that a lot. I think about caregivers a lot who are not able to see their loved ones in facilities or elder care homes, and they're not with them. I think that grief even becomes kind of, I would anticipate, professionally speaking, that grief is going to accelerate. It's going to be there a lot sooner. It's going to be experienced even stronger than it was before. And it is that fear that they're going to die, and that they're going to die there on their own and no one's going to be there for them, or that the person starts to worsen from not being able to have kind of that communication or that experience with their loved ones.
You know, we often hear from caregivers that even though their loved one cannot recognize who they are or call them by their name, I mean, the opportunity of being familiar of who comes into the room and the consistency does affect them when you don't show up anymore.
I'll share a story with a family member who has her mother, a cousin who has her mother in a nursing home. It's been in a facility with Alzheimer's for about 8 years now. And they all took turns going there. It's a big family. There was always somebody, at least minimum of 4 times a week, there was somebody there with her a few hours a day. So she, even though she's completely, unaware of the fact, I mean, her Alzheimer's, she's getting close to her end stages. Once COVID started, about 2 weeks ago, they called me and said, I think we're going to get her out because she's just really going downhill. They said that they're probably going to bring in hospice and that she's dying. Recognizing that she was already at those stages. So what they did is they moved her back to their the townhome that she and her husband lived in. They brought her back there, and now the family and hospice are helping her. Well, they were anticipating that she was in her last days, and guess what? She revived. I mean, she started hearing their voices, and now she's eating and making cussing in Spanish, which was something she always liked to do, and she's come around. But that's not always going to be the case either. And I think the thing is that with that situation with COVID, on top of everything else, now the caregiver has guilt. And that is something that the caregiver is going to have to really seek support to be able to deal with some of these emotions that are really things that are out of your control. And I ask people that all the time. What you only can do so much. Some things are out of control. Some things there's nothing you can do anything about. And that is a big problem with COVID right now for even people that don't have those experiences or are currently caregivers. There is so much that is out of our control, and the weight can really add a lot of emotional grief for everyone. I hope that answers that question.
It does. Thank you, Yvonne.
People need permission to grieve in their own time and their own style without being hurried along. As you see this quote here from Catherine Murray, who's a palliative care nurse educator. They need honest access to support and honest, you see that they need access to support. You see that support there, and honest, accurate information about healthy grief so they can seek help if they become stuck or overwhelmed. There really is no way around being able to manage the grief without seeking support. So in this case, what you mentioned with COVID, it's important that you seek that out. Grieving styles and grief reactions, because we know that they do it in their own way. Researchers have shown that the caregivers tend to have two distinct grieving styles: intuitive and grieving and instrumental grieving. And some caregivers can show both, but these are the two styles that are most commonly seen. Intuitive grievers experience grief as if waves of feeling. It's not something that feels constant for them. They're going to feel this intense inner pain and this sadness and helpless and hopeless and lonely. Guilt, anger, depression, low physical energy, and tears are always some of the ways they show their grief. They do cope by taking time to grieve and sharing feelings with others. And these are some of the feelings you're going to see. These are intuitive grievers. They feel the grief, while instrumental grievers do the grief. That's what the difference is between the two. Intuitive grievers feel the grief, others, instrumental grievers, do the grief. Helpful ways to support someone with intuitive grievers are through active listening, of course, support group, continue to encourage them to express their feelings, their insights, and opportunities to connect and share with others. Because once you start hearing that this is not just your experience and the experience of others, it makes a huge difference. Instrumental grievers, we just talked about, are more like to experience grief intellectually and physically. They're action-oriented. I've heard a lot of people talk about grief that they've experienced, death. When they've experienced death, they talk about how they're action-oriented. They need to get busy. They need to do things. They're task-oriented. They can show their grief by becoming anxious or agitated, hyper-energetic. Hyper-energetic is not always a good thing, rather than depressed and listless. So it's kind of the other extreme. And they immerse themselves in keeping busy and task and projects. Which the unfortunate part of all this is that they're not really, it may physically or even in some cases mentally help them be able to work through this, but it's important that they still have those conversations. Grief is a normal, is a healing response, and it's normal. It's normal and healing response. I want to keep in mind something. Grieving is part of the healing response. That's really important to keep in mind. If you're going to work through this, if you're going to be work toward managing some of these symptoms of grief, understand that it's not a bad situation. It may not feel good, but it's part of your healing. It's ongoing. It will happen throughout the whole progression of the disease. And family caregivers will have to find ways to continually adapt to changes, to new events that occur at different stages of the disease, because we know that those are going to happen. There are going to be different stages, and it's going to bring about new emotions and new feelings that everyone has to be able to contend with, work through, and they have to find the support to be able to do that.
Yvonne, we have another question. One of the questions talking about the healing responses, what are helpful things a friend or family member can do to help caring for someone with Alzheimer's? What are helpful things a friend can do to help a friend caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease? And then there was another question, but I'll allow if you can have an answer for that one, and then I'll ask you the other one as well.
Yeah, I believe that the first thing you do is to ask them what they need. That's the first thing I do when I speak to caregivers that I'm helping, whether it's family or friends. What do you need? You tell me what you need, and I'll do my best to make that happen. And then someone could say to you, I don't know what I need. I really don't know. And then you start out from the very basic task around them, because you're not going to know until you start doing some of those things. Well, why don't I start why don't I start coming over if you can, if you're in the same geographic area, and helping you stay, I'll stay here while you run to the grocery store. Of course, not many of us are running a grocery store right now, but, or why don't I spend some time with your spouse while you take a long bath, or while you go read a book, or while you sit outside, or while you take a walk, or while you try to get some exercise in. And if you're not able to be there to help them in that way, then maybe just talking to them on the phone about everything. I'm worried about you. Trying to engage them in this conversation to be able to talk about what some of these feelings are and be able to work through them. Reminding them about the Alzheimer's Association and the resources available there. Reminding them about support groups. I like one of my favorite caregiver stories is a woman who, was really, couldn't really think of what to tell people to do for her when people would come over and say, what can I do for you? So she just started, as she thought about it throughout the days and the weeks, she made little lists on little yellow sticky notes, and she started to just put them on her refrigerator. So when someone came over, they're like, what can I do for you? She said, any of those things on the refrigerator. So they would pick one out. She even had something like, fix the patio in the back. It's falling down. Someone came over and did that. Get my mail for me. I don't always feel like getting my mail. If you see it there, please bring it to my door. So it can be even though you think it's a small little thing, every single task when the person is grieving is difficult for them. So keep that in mind as well.
I think everything gets very much complicated right now because we're living in COVID. We don't know what post-COVID life is going to be like, but I know that it does complicate it. I just want to remind our audience that if you are in need of a support group, we have several support groups that meet virtually. They meet weekly. You can always contact us directly. I've added the email that you can reach us at in the chat room so that we can give you the details how to connect, as well as the dates and the times that they each meet. In addition, Yvonne, we have another question/comment.
Okay.
As we go through the grieving process and assuming the loss and things like that, what are caregivers of those with persons with a disease who find themselves in the very early stages of the disease sometimes feel overwhelmed by how much their loved ones might be embracing everything they can to delay symptoms. They may not want the disease in their face, but what do you do and what do you tell a caregiver how much do you tell a caregiver that the changes are coming?
I'm not sure I understand all the question, but are you talking about the changes that are coming?
Let me read it again. It says, caregivers of those with a disease who are in early stages sometimes feel overwhelmed by how much their loved ones might be embracing everything they can to delay the symptoms. They may not want the disease in their face. What do you tell a caregiver through that? Like, how do you help them assimilate or understand to a certain extent
that this is real? That the disease is happening and there's no way to get around it?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Now, again, let's talk about anytime getting a diagnosis like this, getting a diagnosis of any disease, any disorder, any disease that has a terminal, that is terminal or life-changing of any way, in any kind, we're going to go through all those of you familiar with Kubler-Ross and her stages of death and of grief and loss. And one of those is denial. Anger, bargaining, denial, you've heard all those, depression, those things occur. And that denial is a stage that everyone's different. And individuals can only take so much. Other people can just pull the Band-Aid, give it all to me right now so that I can start moving forward. Other people are like, hey, I've already got enough on my plate. This is all I can take right now. There is going to be some point though, where where the person with the Alzheimer's is continuing to show symptoms, obviously, and continuing to decline, and the progression is evident, where that person is going to need to seek support to be able to adjust to the changes. Now, I think I know what you're getting at. There's those individuals who are just like, I'm not going to listen to anything else because this is going to get better or it's not going to get worse. So there are going to be situations in which there has to be professional intervention. And if that person isn't willing to go in, then I take you back to the Alzheimer's support group. There's nothing more important than a support group in this situation because you get to hear what others are experiencing as well. So is there a single answer for that question? There's absolutely not, because it just depends on the person. And if I was working with that person individually and consulting with them, I would probably be able to give more suggestions or ideas. But I can't stress enough how important it is to start to seek support. And sometimes if you're trying to talk with that person and they're still not listening, that person, whoever asked this question, it could be important for you to go to support group too, or to the Alzheimer's Association for information on how to be able to deal with this, or talk to a physician.
And again, just, reminding the audience that we have a fabulous 800 number. Our helpline is available to you 24/7. It is 1-800-272-3900. It is available in the chat as well. And you can call any time of the day if you're feeling overwhelmed and really have these conversations with a licensed facilitator.
Oh, hold on a second.
Those are all the questions we have, but you can continue.
Thanks. In addition to this, I hope that when this session ends, and that you'll read up some more on it or ask more questions through your association, because some of you might already be aware that grief is there. It may seem obvious to you, but it can creep up on you. It can go on longer than you would like for it to do. It can intensify. Some days you're going to feel better, while other days you don't. So it's important to stay on top of it, and important to recognize that your symptoms, your stress may be related to this. It's rooted in a profound and painful paradox, because the person with dementia is physically present, but often psychologically absent. So this paradoxical thinking is a way for you, the caregiver, to explore and learn ways to tolerate or live with the many uncomfortable ambiguities that arise out of the disease. And so some examples of those are: the spouse may feel married and not married to her husband. The caregiver daughter can feel like both a daughter and a parent to her father, even though a parent is always present. And a parent is always a parent. And this kind of paradoxical thinking, to understand it, to realize it, to acknowledge it, is a way for you to cope with it. A way for you to, sometimes once you accept and acknowledge the situation before you, it's easier for that person to be able to manage it. That's just a kind of a simple mental health 101 that often in working with patients, that's the direction we would go with their families. Remembering that the person with dementia has needs, but so does the family member who cares for that person has needs. You may love that person deeply with dementia, and they don't even know who you are. And then here's the paradox: you want the person to live as long as possible, yet you want the pain to end. So there's another ambiguity. There's another paradox that the person might have to deal with. What I'm telling you by this is that those feelings are absolutely normal and nothing to feel guilty about. But it can cause a significant amount of stress and for the caregiver as well. So learn to make the shift from thinking that the person with dementia is either alive or has passed away, to realize that the person is both present and not present. So what are you doing here? You're kind of shifting the way in which you look at it, the terms that you use. Instead of believing and feeling that either the needs of the person with dementia or the needs of the caregiver must take priority, the caregiver realizes that both sets of needs are important. It's not just one or the other. This is a difficult transition for a lot of caregivers to make. Sometimes it just has to do with the fact that the caregiver just rather do it all by themselves, and they don't want anybody to come in because nobody does it the way they do it or as good as they do it. Sometimes it's the caregiver's fault that this is even happening. So the caregiver has to step back and say, what is my role here in not making the situation a bit easier for myself and a bit easier for me to manage? This is a very important slide in making that transition. So steps to living positively with loss. I mean, I think this is kind of an interesting heading for this slide. So people say, well, how can you live positively with loss? Well, you can. There are many steps one person can take to live positively while caring for a spouse or parent with dementia, with Alzheimer's or dementia. So here's some of them here. See, there's some of the strategies. I don't know if you can see this. It was covered up. Strategies for living positively with ambiguous loss and grief. Reflect on the losses that occur in the life with dementia and or Alzheimer's and the dementia and their own lives as well. So, sometimes you just have to sit back, maybe journal, maybe write these things down, maybe outside working on the garden, maybe while you're washing dishes, maybe while you're taking a shower, just kind of reflect on that. Acknowledge it and express and share the grief that the caregiver feels in response to those losses. So again, coming back to finding someone or a group to share that with. Stay connected to your family and friends. Stay connected. A lot of caregivers have told me that it's hard to feel connected to family and friends when you feel like you don't have much to share. Just the same old story of caregiving. But you would be surprised of how you can enhance those relationships by being open to nurturing the relationships you had or building even new relationships. And looking after your own needs. I can't say that enough. Emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, taking care of your own needs. Let people know how they can help rather than assuming people know what they need. Well, I tell you what, this is a big, big issue for caregivers. You're waiting for someone to do something. You're like, well, I shouldn't have to tell them to do anything. Well, maybe you do. Maybe there are some people who need to be told. There are other people who don't want to do anything. Determine who the ones that want to help are, and the ones that don't, talk with them when you can. But don't expect anything from someone who has just pretty much let you know that they don't want to do anything. This is also an issue for caregivers a lot of times. Seek out information about Alzheimer's and what to expect. Educate yourself on all that you can regarding this. It'll help you manage the situation so much easier if you just know more about it. Because if you don't know about it, it's fear. It creates a sense of fear, or you end up making stuff in your head that aren't true. I think I'm going over my time here. Share advice, express grief in creative ways, and recognize and value your own growth as a person. You can express in creative ways grief through writing and painting, photography, or other art forms. And recognize and value your own growth as a person. Just because you're a caregiver doesn't mean that you still can't evolve as a human being. You still can't take on something that you've always wanted to do. You might have to change the way in which you do it. You might have to find something different, but find a way to care for yourself. You can learn new skills. You can find a way to better handle your finances if you need that, by maybe taking some classes online, become more compassionate, find your inner strength, and find your resilience to be able to work through this. All this sounds like it's like, oh, she makes that sound so easy. How am I going to do any of those things? If you want this experience to be different than the way you're experiencing it now, you can find ways to make these things happen. Building resilience and personal strength and hope. Because we know that ambiguous loss and grief is an integral part of the caregiving experience, getting that support, find ways to restore your energy and balance. Despite your limited time, find ways to, even if it's 5 minutes, make some positive self-care choices. Listen to positive feedback. Don't don't see people who are trying to share with you positive experiences or positive advice as just being something that gets in your way and that you don't want to hear. Remember, all that can be due to depression and sadness and frustration. And again, you may have to seek help otherwise to be able to manage that. You might have to seek help with a therapist or a physician to help you manage depressive symptoms that are getting out of control and keeping you from being able to find your resilience, to find the strength within yourself to take care of yourself and to take care of someone else. Hope can be renewed. That renewal of hope occurs every time a caregiver makes a positive adjustment to the challenges and changes in the person with dementia and their own situation. That sentence is really one of the best sentences in this whole presentation. You can renew that hope every time you make that positive adjustment. It comes from personal growth. It comes by taking on new responsibilities. It comes by educating yourself, finding support, acquiring the skills, and finding the resilience to be able to do these things. If you don't have what it takes to move forward, then get some help so that you can do so to address the reasons that's not happening. Any questions?
Yvonne, thank you so much for this great presentation. I think I can take myself off of the no video. And ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, please let us know. We can unmute your line, submit them via the chat, or raise the hand feature in the chat as well. And we would ask Dr. Lozano. There is a question in the chat that says, if a person with Alzheimer's has told their caretaker what they want to happen before and after their death, should the caregiver do all they were asked to do, especially regarding the time after death, especially the plans for funeral and the following months?
That is a very, very personal question. Meaning, what I mean by that is there are going to be, obviously the wishes for funeral and arrangements is essential. On a personal level and professional level, I'm a strong advocate of meeting those wishes for that person after their death. If those were their wishes. Now, sometimes those wishes can't be met before their death, like a living will. There's other situations that might become involved due to illness. But if a person says, I don't want certain things in place before I die, or I want you to do everything you can to keep me alive, those wishes need to be, that's exactly what they are. They're the person's wishes, and absolutely. But again, it's a personal decision, but there's a reason that person gave you the wishes to honor what they're wanting after their death. And I would hope that those would be honored.
And so how do you manage conversations amongst families when the mere conversation around death and arrangements is never had? And now you find yourself in this position where you have to have them because something significant has happened. And that's very true of, especially for, Hispanic families. I don't know of, but oftentimes it's not talked about.
The United States, I mean, I talk about this at the university, and the United States has a overall, we're a country that's known as having a fear of death. Where in other countries, they see it as an end of life, a new life, whatever someone's religious beliefs may be, their spiritual beliefs, those are kind of things that help people to be able to move forward and cope. And in other situations, people, depending on what their beliefs are, they may think so very differently. But the fact is that people fear it. But death is just as inevitable as birth is. When we start the minute that we're born is the day, if you want to look at it this way, but I tell my students, the day that we're born is the day we start living, but it's also the day we start dying. That is the beginning, and the beginning of what will be an end, and hopefully a long life for people. I can't stress enough, for my students, I'm going to tell you about this little assignment I have them do. At Thanksgiving time, before Thanksgiving, they have to go and their assignment for Thanksgiving, or when they go home, is to talk to their parents about their wishes. not only their wishes as a student, but also the wishes of the parents. 7 times out of 10, students come back and say, my parents didn't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it. They don't think it's important. I cannot stress to you enough that conversation. Now, here's what I tell people. If your family says, I don't care, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to deal with it. If you're the person who wants to make last wishes, then put it on a video on your phone, write it down and sign it and date it, put an envelope and tell somebody where it is. If someone else doesn't want to have that conversation to make those wishes, you need to keep asking them and asking them until they change their mind. Make it easy for them to do it. Make it easy for them to have the conversation. If they don't want to document, then write it down. But quite frankly, it is a topic. It is one of the most common questions that people ask me all the time. How can I get my family to start making end of life care plans and go to estate planning? Because no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to acknowledge it. No one wants to see the reality of it until something happens. And then everybody's saying, well, what do they want? Or what should we do? Well, we couldn't have the conversation now. Now what's going to happen? So how do you have that conversation? Keep having the conversation until somebody does something about it. I wish there was an easier answer, but I know it's difficult.
Someone did share, one of our participants did share in themselves. Thank you for the presentation. It described what I experienced with my husband and helps me understand and accept my grief better.
Great, good. I'm glad. Thank you for that.
Very much, and also in Facebook, another participant says renewing hope, something we all need right now, especially because of the situation that we're living in. And I'm assuming, like you mentioned throughout the presentation, that the grieving process gets that much more complicated right now because of COVID-19. We can't see our loved ones. We can't visit. If they are admitted to the hospital, in many cases, they are not allowed to come in as well. And so it is that much more complicated as we go through it.
Well, and you might have to communicate through the professional caregiver at the facility and just say, look, they like for me to, every time I went, I massaged his hands, or every time I went, I combed her hair or combed his hair, or I washed his hair for him. Can you please make sure someone does that today or tomorrow? Can you, and then call me to let me know. Just kind of tell them what are some of the things that you did that kind of helped that person. Maybe some music. They really, when I came, I used to like to bring photos or play some music for them. Not playing music for the whole group, but just kind of individualize and connect with that person, and ask the caregiver to do that. I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but that would be good. I know that sounds, but you know what? If it just can make you feel better. I remember a story of one of my colleagues whose mother was at a facility here in San Antonio, and she was in, and she went from assisted living, then eventually went into the long-term care nursing home side. And she wanted to make sure that her mother was checked on regularly while she was at work. So every morning she got there at 6:30 every morning and put a big bowl of those really nice Hershey chocolates, the dark chocolates, all those different kinds. She said, my mother got so much attention by that, people coming in to grab some candy, and they would check on her and say hi to her and talk to her. She did that forever. We have 2 more minutes.
We have 2 more minutes. Any other questions or comments, or any parting words, Yvonne, for us that we can take away today?
You guys, I just want to say, back to COVID, I know this is a tough time for all of us, for everyone, and I cannot imagine what that must be like for those of you who can't be with your loved ones, can't be, or who are caregivers, and who are caregivers in the middle of COVID, who have those loved ones with you at home that you're caring for. Seek support from the Alzheimer's Association. I cannot stress that enough. Go to as many virtual conferences as you can go to, sessions. I know they're having things on a weekly basis. I love what I do. I'm telling you, being a volunteer, doing this right now in virtual helps me too. Feeling a sense of purpose. That, and now I've taken on painting rocks, by the way. I laugh at that because I never thought I'd be a rock painter, but I've done things that I never thought I would do before. I'm trying to be creative. I'm trying to find that sense of hope find that sense of hope, and find that sense of, if you find the hope, you'll find the positivity and you'll find the resilience. I wish you guys all the best. I really do. And take care.
Dr. Lozano, thank you very much for today's presentation. I'm hoping that our caregivers and participants have a great takeaway. And if you need a copy of the presentation, or rather the PowerPoint, we can ask Dr. Lozano if she can provide some of that information, and we will share with everybody. Let's also know that it is being recorded via Facebook Live. So if you want to go back to catch or capture some of the comments, you may do that as well.
Okay. Take care. Have a good, happy Saturday.
You too. Thank you, Dr. Lozano. Have a good day.
Hey everybody, it's Jonathan Barker, your Walk to End Alzheimer's chairman. I'm out here at this year's new walk venue, and it's a little bit slow right now, but come October 24th, we're going to be turning Six Flags Fiesta Texas purple. I'm very excited about this new opportunity, and I'm even more excited to announce that not only is the walk going to be inside Six Flags, but they're offering us free parking for all participants, as well as the option to purchase a half-price ticket to stay for the rest of the day. We're really excited about the opportunity to grow, and we look forward to seeing you out here at the walk on October 24th. Y'all have a great day, and we'll see y'all soon.
Hey Austin, we miss seeing you at our walks, fundraisers, educational programs, and conferences. And while 2020 has been a tough one, we are all in it together. We here at the Alzheimer's Association are still fighting every day for a world without Alzheimer's, and we are still striving to provide caregivers with the support and education they need to do their good work. Unfortunately, Alzheimer's isn't taking a break for quarantine, so as they say out in Hollywood, our show must go on. So, with that in mind, our 2020 CareGiver Conference will be held virtually, Saturday, July 11th from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. With presentations from these brilliant dementia care professionals, as well as panels on finding common ground in caregiving across generational lines, and addressing resources that may help pay for long-term care solutions, you really don't want to miss this. Registering to attend is just as easy as clicking the link above and following the simple instructions. And once again, the 2020 Austin Caregiver Conference will be held July 11th from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Have a good one, y'all. See you Saturday.